Time is 1:15. It's time for another AI ethics seminar. This time, it's my great pleasure to introduce Andrea Owe, who's a Norwegian environmental philosopher and a research associate at the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, which I believe is situated in the United States. So you work remotely from Norway. Andrea will talk to us about deepening AI ethics, AI and why we are in an environmental crisis. Sounds like an important topic. Please go ahead.
Thank you. It's quite a depressing topic. Let me just share my screen here. Let's see. Yes, hello. Okay, can you see my screen?
It's not yet full screen. I see it. There it is.
There it is. Sorry, it's being a bit slow. All right. Thank you, Ole, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So just following up on your short introduction a little bit, I would like to just say a few words on this sort of frameworks that I'm working in. Being an environmental philosopher, it means that I have a philosophical lens that's particularly colored by our relationship to the rest of the natural world. And environmental ethics is specifically about the moral aspects of this relationship and the moral values inherent in the natural world. And global catastrophic risk, for those who are not familiar, is the risk of events that could significantly harm or even destroy human civilization at the global scale. And that includes things such as asteroid impacts, nuclear war, potentially climate change, and certain forms of future advanced AI. Different scholars set the bar a bit differently for what constitutes the global catastrophic risk. For example, I think it's important to also consider harms to more than just humans. And long-termism is another perspective that I find useful. And that is one reason for focusing on mitigating global catastrophic risks. It means seeing the long-term future as morally important. For example, because if we overcome global catastrophic risks, we or our descendants may have a long-term future that's astronomically large, which could include vast numbers of morally relevant beings, experiences, or whatever you think has moral value, and overall a very big opportunity space for advancing good things. So these are the sort of frameworks that I tend to work in. And lately, I've been focusing on applying these perspectives to the ethics of AI, with a motivation of sort of making sure that we avoid repeating past mistakes through AI, and that AI ends up being a truly beneficial technology for both people and the rest of nature now and into the future. So the overarching theme of this seminar is this nexus of AI and the fact that we find ourselves in what is really both a social and ecological planetary crisis, with sustainability being the sort of umbrella term for how to get through that crisis. And I'm of course going to share with you some of my research, but for that to make sense, I'll first spend a little time on giving you a bit of a context in the form of some brief thoughts on why we are in this situation, why it matters, and the role of AI in the middle of it. And I also share some observations of the current status of this space across AI and sustainability. And that section is also partly drawing on findings from my own research. Then I'll move on to share some findings from my research on anticentrism and AI specifically. And at the end, we'll sum up and consider some further questions that I think are important for the field of AI ethics to study as we go forward. All right, so first a bit of context. Why does this nexus of AI, sustainability, and ethics matter? First, I want to just comment briefly on ethics itself, because I think many people don't think much about ethics in this theoretical sense. I think in many sectors and industries, ethics is sort of the dry term or this annoying checklist paper that needs to be filled out. But ethics is really everywhere. whether we think about it or not, our personal lives are oriented around certain moral values, as are our institutions, the cultures we live in, and our economic and political systems. So we all really enact ethics on a constant basis. So if there are any like computer science or engineering students in the audience who's only had that one boring ethics class that your professor sort of chuck away as unimportant, then I want you to rather see ethics as the question of what world do we want to realize? And I think if you believe that AI can truly be this world transformative technology, then you should probably be interested in that question. So the first point of context I want to make is that the current socio-ecological crisis is not solely an issue of like greenhouse gas emissions or shifting to renewable energy. It is the result of several specific philosophies about what is important, what is right, what is true, and what is of value. And these have shaped modern civilization. We may call these isms. Important examples in this context include colonialism, imperialism, industrialism, capitalism, neoliberalism, consumerism, and anthropocentrism. And all these isms are also value systems. They hold specific ethical assumptions, and they are meant to serve and promote specific interests. So very simply, we can say that they have determined how progress has been and continues to be defined. And some important assumptions that are inherent in these systems of thought that have driven modern civilization over the past few centuries include, for example, the appropriation and ownership of land, property, and other living beings. It includes an emphasis on the importance and autonomy of the individual over, for example, community membership, the idea of indefinite growth in a physical world that is inherently finite and which functional systems are really circular and not linear. It includes the idea that human well-being can be measured by material possessions. Another is the idea that humans are raised above the rest of nature, that nature is inanimate matter, free for humans to use as we wish. And the idea that some groups have the right to dominate others on various dubious grounds, such as species membership, race, gender, cognitive capacities, physical strength, or religious beliefs. Of course, some of these isms have also brought about many things besides environmental harm, including great benefits to people and society, such as decreased poverty and technological innovation. But for better or worse, these systems of thought have also brought about what is now an ecological crisis, which also includes immense social injustices. And I think it's quite uncontroversial to say that their accumulation can no longer really be called progress. So what this means is that to overcome the environmental crisis, there seems to also be a need to overthrow some of these systems of thought that have caused the problem in the first place. And the recognition of these sort of underlying currents of sustainability as an issue vary strongly from field to field and from sector to sector. And I'll say that the technology sector is not exactly coming out very well on that scale. We'll have a closer look at that a bit later on. Yes, the second point of context that I want to make is about the bigger picture of how much it matters what systems of thoughts and moral values to be advanced, whether knowingly or indirectly, and how much is potentially at stake. In everyday life, we probably don't think much about what isms and moral values we advance. But if certain isms and moral values are at the heart of the climate crisis, then that also means that isms and moral values have the potential to produce or at least contribute to global catastrophic risks. In other words, we can pursue ways of thinking and valuing that actually leads us toward great self-harm and potentially self-destruction. Now, while the climate crisis sort of illustrates this near-term aspect of global catastrophic risk with its urgency, global catastrophic risk also has a long-term aspect, as mentioned earlier, in the sense that by overcoming risks, we may open up an opportunity space for continuing and developing society and our world that is astronomically large and long-term, for example, by becoming multiplanetary. So this opportunity space can be seen as an opportunity to accomplish great things in the future. This is one common motivation for focusing on global catastrophic risk. So in this sense, which systems of thought we advance, it's not only a question of overcoming a crisis situation here and now, but also about making sure that there can be a longer-term future which could outweigh the present in its moral potential. So what's the role of AI in all of this? Well, as a general purpose technology, AI is already being put to advance certain values and interests. It's not a morally neutral technology, and it can likewise be put to advance others if we want to. And I think that for AI to truly be beneficial for people and the planet, to actually advance sustainability in a meaningful sense, I think AI ethics must critically engage with these underlying currents of the human nature predicaments. So for present and near-term AI, this means that there's a need to design and apply AI in a manner that actively breaks away from those systems of thoughts that are problematic. It means ensuring that AI is beneficial for people in a just manner, as well as beneficial to other species and the rest of nature. And it entails making AI contribute to mitigating global catastrophic risks so that we can have a long-term future. And for long-term advanced AI, there are actually some dual considerations in this regard, because on the one hand, long-term AI may be a global catastrophic risk itself in the case of certain scenarios with advanced AI going rogue or whatever you want to call it. And in that case, we have questions of how different systems of thought and moral values play into such scenarios. And on the other hand, if we succeed with developing advanced AI that are capable of realizing great things the way we want it, then such AI may play an important role in enabling and pursuing that astronomical opportunity space. For example, by playing an important role in space expansion and in maximizing moral goods at great scales. So that raises the question of what fundamental long-term objectives do we want to direct AI towards? And for both the catastrophic and, let's say, fantastic AI scenarios, there's also the question of whether decisions we make about AI today, including by what ethics we develop and apply AI, may have important implications for such advanced long-term AI. So that was sort of three main points of context that I wanted to bring to your attention. The underlying isms or current human nature predicament, the big picture considerations of global catastrophic risk and the long-term future, and the implications range from near-term to long-term AI. Okay, so what does the current landscape look like across this AI, sustainability, and ethics space? I think first, let's have a brief look at what's going on at the forefront of the sustainability domain, because sustainability is a very encompassing field. It's basically concerned with enabling a future that is better than the present on advancing certain broadly agreed upon goods and values. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals have 169 sub-goals, and they're related to everything from education, health, and economics to inequalities, the environment, non-human life, and our institutions. So in that sense, what's going on in the field of sustainability can be a good metric for what is generally going on in the thinking space about what kind of society and world do we want to bring about for tomorrow. And for AI as technological frontier, I think what's going on in the sustainability frontier should therefore be of great interest. So what we're seeing in the sustainability field is that there's active engagement with certain social, political, and economic frontiers, such as decolonization and degrowth. There's a major focus on justice being at the core of how we move forward. In other words, what we consider societal progress. Likewise, there's critical attention to what exactly constitutes progress. Like, what are we trying to achieve and for whom? And how do we evaluate progress? There's attention to the role of power dynamics to obtain sustainability, and there's emphasis on sustainability being more long-term oriented, meaning intergenerational responsibility and the fact that nature and society co-evolve. Still, my sense is that this long-term orientation is significantly shorter than a kind of astronomical long-term picture I drew earlier. Regardless, these points of emphasis in the sustainability field show that the field is to a significant extent being mindful about which systems of thoughts and moral values it wants to promote. So let's have a look at what's going on with AI in this regard. There has been a significant development in the overall AI discourse over the past few years to sort of move away from the narrow interests of developers and toward AI serving more altruistic and public interest. We're seeing initiatives on AI for people, AI for good, and AI for the sustainable development goals, and many calls for AI to benefit humanity or benefit all people. And this is also reflected in statements of AI ethics principles, which hundreds of groups, organizations, and corporations have published over the past few years. So this is really an important step for the field. But what we're not seeing as much of yet is sort of concrete action on how exactly AI is to have such altruistic benefits. Which humanity do these statements and people have in mind? What voices have been considered when defining what beneficial AI means, and what voices have been left out. For example, we found in our research that most AI ethics guidelines do not actually define terms like benefit or beneficial. So despite what I'm sure are in many cases good intentions, I think there's reason for concern if AI for good is sort of designed and applied within cognitive frameworks that have proven problematic in terms of the environmental situation and its social dimensions, and that this could leave calls for broadly beneficial AI to be rather superficial. But there is also a small but growing focus on AI and sustainability specifically. And here I found that there is, first of all, still very little work on AI and sustainability. For example, I found that in a collection of 84 sets of AI ethics principles, only 11 include any kind of reference to sustainability, and 7 of them being about environmental sustainability. And on the work that do exist on AI and sustainability, the focus is predominantly on sort of green tech solutions, on applying AI for various environmental purposes, or it's on the environmental footprint of AI systems themselves, or they're on AI in relation to sort of broader sustainability frameworks such as the SDGs. And it's also the case that in sustainability work at large, there's a lot of unclarity on what exactly is meant by sustainability. Often sustainability is used as the equivalent of good for society or good for people. But as with AI for good or beneficial AI, what exactly does that mean? Whose definition of good are we talking about? What exactly is to be sustained and why? So this sort of ambiguity in sustainability work has been reproduced in work on AI and sustainability. And on the screen here, you can see an example from a publication on AI and sustainability, where all of these uses of the term sustainability appear in the abstract and an introduction alone. Of course, this is not to undermine the great work that a lot of people are doing on AI and sustainability, but I think there's nonetheless very little work that looks into sort of underlying causes of why we now need to strive towards sustainability and how AI can play into that. That said, I want to bring an example of what might be the first exception from what I just said, and that is when it comes to AI and social inequity. As I'm sure everyone here is aware of, there's a lot of current focus on how AI may perpetuate certain social harms through algorithmic biases, because human social biases are inherent in the data sets that AI systems are trained on, and also because the field of AI is very much dominated by a specific demographic group. Now, work on AI and social inequity may not be environmentally motivated, but nonetheless, social inequity is intrinsically linked to environmental harm through exploitative structures. So work on social inequity often contributes to environmental sustainability. I think the work being done at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence is a very particularly promising example of this kind of work. But still, there's a lot remaining here as well. For example, on how exactly can AI advance social justice and equity as long as it remains under the control of big tech, or more generally, as long as it disproportionately advances the interests of the dominating culture, or work on expanding the data sets to include other demographics, other cultures, and other languages, for example. So in short, from my observations across these fields, there's still a lot of work remaining on sort of placing AI in context with the various problematic systems of thought underlying modern society, and especially those that pertain to how we engage with the natural environment. So it means that the technological frontier kind of has a lot of catching up to do to align itself with the sustainability frontier. And what I'm outlining here is, of course, essentially a massive interdisciplinary project for AI ethics as a field. And of course, I cannot do all that on my own, and I'm far from an expert on all of these topics. So what I have done is to pick up on one of these threads, while I hope that others will pick up other threads. And as an environmental philosopher, I picked a thread that I'm most qualified to study, namely anthropocentrism. So specifically, my recent research has looked into to what extent anthropocentrism is also dominant in the field of AI, driven by this concern that anthropocentric AI risks perpetuating harms to non-humans and the natural world, and that also to humans. And anthropocentrism is really both a worldview and a value system. It can be ontological and it can be ethical, and it can be both. Ontological anthropocentrism is the view that humans are distinct from the rest of the natural world. And ethical anthropocentrism is the view that humans are better or more important than all other beings and entities that exist, or could exist for that matter, just on grounds of being human. And in moral philosophy terms, this is the view that humans are the only entities that are intrinsically valuable. That is something being valuable for its own sake or in its own right, and the rest of nature having instrumental value for humans, meaning that they are of value to the extent that they contribute to human interests. So in short, with anthropocentrism, whenever there is a conflict of interests, human interests always prevail. And even though ontological anthropocentrism has really been rejected by modern science for centuries, and various ethical rejections have been advanced for an equally long time, both views really remain very common today. And one important thing that the sort of anthropocentric outlook has done is to conceptualize the rest of nature as basically dead material and economic resources. And at that, it has justified what we have done to the rest of the living world in the name of benefits to humans. And in my opinion, anthropocentrism is really a sort of modern illusion. It makes us behave in ways that destroy our own home, other living beings, and ultimately ourselves. So therefore, this is one important system of thought underlying the environmental crisis, which rejection I think is absolutely essential to obtain sustainability. So in my research, I've analyzed published sets of AI ethics principles. I looked at the stated goals of AGI projects. I've looked at AI ethics research and on AI research on sustainability specifically. And overall, I've found that non-human animals and the natural environment are rarely given any kind of moral consideration across the field of AI, and very limited attention overall. For example, in AI ethics principles, non-humans are not considered in principles of justice and fairness, of freedom and autonomy, of dignity, of non-maleficence. Non-maleficence principles are primarily concerned with cyber warfare or economic loss. And non-humans are only to a very limited extent considered in principles of beneficence and sustainability. And among the 45 AGI projects we looked at, most articulate goals that are intellectual, such as the intellectual accomplishment of the AGI self, or using the AGI to pursue intellectual goals. Quite a lot state the goal of benefiting humanity, and only a very few mention any kinds of benefits to non-human animals or the environment. And across major sort of academic, governmental, and corporate AI work, including multi-stakeholder entities such as the Partnership on AI, we found significant moral consideration for humans and very little for non-humans and environment. And in AI ethics research, there is a significant line of research on the moral status of AI systems themselves, especially on sort of hypothetical future forms of AI, but also almost no attention to non-human animals or the environment. And similarly, in AI work on sustainability specifically, I've also found that much sustainability work in general is anthropocentric in the sense that it's human populations that are to be sustained, with the natural environment being valued to the extent that it contributes to the sustaining of humans. This is the case with almost all work based on the SDGs. And this anthropocentrism has likewise been reproduced in AI work on sustainability. So some implications of all of this for how AI may or may not contribute to sustainability include that, first of all, there's a major need for research on the various ways in which AI relates to non-humans and environment. This is really a major blind spot in the field. And more specific implications include, for example, a risk for non-human algorithmic biases. This underlying problem of data bias also pertains to anthropocentric biases against non-humans and environment, especially if the data is coming from predominantly anthropocentric cultures. For example, in the field of ecolinguistics, it's shown that present-day English is deeply anthropocentric. We talk about non-human animals and nature in ways that reinforces this idea that we are separated from and above nature, that non-humans are consumer products, that nature's role is to serve us, that animals are of less worth and have no moral status, that they are not individuals, and so on. Examples of this, for example, words like livestock and game. We don't eat ground cow and pig chops, but beef and pork. And we manage and thin out forests and wildlife populations rather than kill them. So that form of algorithmic bias is about human attitudes towards non-humans, but one can also consider it algorithmic biases that data representing the voices of non-humans are not included in the data sets. Another implication is the importance of accounting for non-human interests and the environmental footprint of AI systems when we select which AI projects to pursue. And that includes acknowledging when it's not in the best interest to develop or use an AI system in the first place. There are a lot of proposals for applying AI to aid with various environmental issues, but enormous amounts of energy and natural resources needed to run AI systems are rarely accounted for. There are lots of AI solutions that are based on sort of bigger and bigger data sets and bigger data centers. But essentially, the more data, the bigger environmental footprints. So to ensure that an AI system is net environmentally beneficial, we really need to consider sort of holistically all environmental aspects of the full life cycle of the AI system. A third implication is, how do we account for non-human values and interests when we design AI systems? For example, the leading proposed methods in AI value alignment for creating ethical machines or ensuring that AI does what we want it to do, such as inverse reinforcement learning, they are based on deriving human values from observing human behavior, and then aligning AI to the preferences of individual humans. And these methods are not easily applicable to non-humans, such as an ecosystem, who don't behave in the same sense as a human. And human individual preferences are not necessarily a sufficient moral framework to ensure sustainability. Like sustainability in its essence is about sort of all members of an ecosystem having their interests met to a roughly equal extent. And how we design ethical AI may be of particular importance for certain long-term AI scenarios where an advanced AGI or something similar takes a major position in the world, in the sense that even the most well-designed AI or AGI could really be catastrophic for some non-humans if it's designed to advance the interest of humans or other non-humans for that matter. And this brings us back to that long-term opportunity space, because in this sense, the relevance of AI to sustainability sort of takes on another meaning, namely that AI can potentially play an important role in the very sustaining and flourishing of life and civilization itself, and or any other things that we think are important at a scale that really far exceeds the sustainable development goals. Okay, I think it's time to sum up. So first of all, the main point I want to bring to your attention is that I see a major need for AI ethics to focus much more on the bigger picture, on the overall role we want AI to play in the world, how to realize that, what goods AI can bring along, including into the distant future. And doing that through critical engagement with the sort of underlying currents and causes of our current human nature predicament, and the counter currents that seems particularly promising. And that means that near-term AI should focus on, first of all, overcoming global catastrophic risks and help transforming human society toward socio-ecological sustainability. And long-term AI ethics should really focus on making the world, or potentially the universe, be as good as it possibly can be. And that, of course, includes studying what that might mean. And I think the most obvious challenge to all of this, which many people don't seem to want to talk about, is, of course, that AI is a product of that very demographic which has historically benefited from the unjust and exploitative systems of thought and action, which means that on a general basis, this demographic has the least reason to either recognize and or care about the harmful impacts of these systems on those less fortunate, whether human or non-human. And secondly, the field is still very disciplinary homogeneous. Now that AI has impacts and implications that go way beyond the field of technology, there's, first of all, a need for the inclusion of a range of other disciplines in the development of AI. And I think there's also a need for ethics and sort of broader societal perspectives in the educational programs of engineers and computer scientists. Even moral philosophy work on AI is philosophically homogeneous, with utilitarianism being massively overrepresented. So what I've done with the perpetuation of anthropocentrism through AI, it's one important example for how we need to consider the bigger picture, but it's just one of many. So I hope that other AI ethicists will pick up some of these other threads. And in that regard, I think that some useful questions that we could consider could be, for example, how can AI contribute to transforming our economic system? Can AI promote greener consumer habits and greener sort of cultural values? AI, in some cases, casts a sort of threat to democracy, but could it instead advance democracy? How can we ensure not only that AI doesn't perpetuate colonial practices, but actively works toward decolonization? I think by starting to address these types of questions, then we can actually start talking about truly beneficial AI and AI towards a sustainable world. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for this very interesting and thought-provoking talk on what we really must regard as an important topic. I now invite questions and comments from the audience. Maybe, Andrea, if you want to take down your slides so we can see each other.
Sorry, of course. Just move my camera.
So feel free to raise your hand or ask questions in the chat, or maybe we are sufficiently few people in the room that you can just grab the microphone and ask. Björn has a question.
Yeah, hi, Andrea. Thank you for your talk. The whole time you talked, I had this question. I recognize much of what you say. I've thought about this myself in much the same terms as you seem to have. And in the end, my question is something like, what's the main difference now as opposed to, say, for 30, 40 years ago? What's the difference in our situation regarding all of the things that you've mentioned with and without AI? To my mind, maybe the answer is not so much in a sense. But on the other hand, I guess you feel that AI gives us a new starting point, a new vantage point. Maybe we can diverge. Maybe we have more leverage to actually work towards the goals that you've mentioned. On the other hand, as you just said yourself, AI seems to come from the very source of our troubles. So could you say something more about that, please?
Yeah, I guess it depends, what we think AI will actually sort of become. Still a lot of speculations, and on the one hand, about where AI is coming from, it's easy to sort of oppose all of that and just kind of conclude that AI will be something bad because it's coming from that direction. But then, well, it's also a fact that it is already happening, and we need to sort of do the best with what we have. Like if AI will take on a very dominant role in human cultures because it's coming from where all the power and money is, then at least we have a responsibility to try and shape it in the best way possible, instead of just sort of opposing what is happening. And then, as I said, beyond that, then I think it depends how powerful will AI really become, and that's almost like just individual beliefs, I think. But it's already, even the type of AI we have today with, you know, algorithms used in social media and so on, like, it's already impacting what information people receive. It's impacting humans' consumer habits and so on. So there's already a lot of power in that space, even if the AI is not particularly intelligent or advanced or capable in that sense. But it's already a form of, you know, manipulation going on that we need to cast like social science perspectives on. Yeah, that's one point of this. Thanks for your question.
Thank you. I have a question. So when I look at utilitarians and people in effective altruism and so on, what they gravitate towards in terms of whose interest matters, I think that there's an expansion from just considering humans, but they seem to gravitate towards other sentient beings, which presumably includes cattle and chicken and so on. But it probably does not include mountains and the fjords and stuff like that, which I associate this idea with Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, I think. So do you have an opinion here on how broadly we should draw the circle? Do you think that the class of sentient beings is the relevant one here, or are there other choices?
So my personal position is similar to Arne Næss. Like, I'm what's called an ecocentric environmental philosopher. So I think there's more value in sort of holistic ecosystem level. But even, as you say, even in the effective altruism community, and like one reason why we're even working on this topic at GCRI is that we haven't really, like, no one else is really doing it. Like, there is attention to other sentient animals in the effective altruism community, but the bridge between that and AI ethics in the effective altruism community hasn't really been built. Like, there's some work getting started on it, but it's we were very surprised to find that why aren't people working on this, because we know that people care about this on the one hand and this on the other hand. But yeah, among those who do, this definitely stops at other sentient animals, which is of course better than just humans. But if you ask me personally, it's not good enough. It's very, I mean, there are many reasons for that, but it's that kind of biocentrism or sentientcentrism is very individualistically oriented. For example, it's sort of focused on the individual well-being of certain animals. And I mean, one reason why I think ecocentrism makes more sense is that it kind of reflects how the natural world works to a great extent. Like, the world is very sort of relation-based, and there's a lot of interdependencies. I find it hard to sort of take the individual out of the system that is part of. But there's much more that can be said about that, but that's a whole philosophical debate. And you don't have to agree with a specific non-anthropocentric position to sort of see the points of what I just talked about. Like, there are many forms of non-anthropocentrism, and probably all of them are better than anthropocentrism, and we can join forces where we agree. Like, even at GCRI, we have different moral positions, but we can still work together and advance non-anthropocentric AI.
Yeah, thank you. Are there further questions or comments? Alexis? Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you for a really great presentation. It was really interesting to hear about. I haven't been to so many sort of AI-related presentations that have this holistic perspective that you gave. So I have a question about, do you have any thoughts on I mean, one thing that strikes me about, let's say, big tech, technology, artificial intelligence, and so on, it's a very hyped subject, and many people sort of see the potential, including myself, in various ways that it can benefit many parts of society. But do you also think that there's a risk that, I mean, the hype is too big, and sort of that AI may not be as helpful as we might want it to be for this greater sustainability crisis and so on?
Yeah, I'm worried about that, exactly for these reasons. The potential might be there, but if the whole way we sort of conceptualize what AI is and what sort of NSA is and who's making those decisions, if all of that is coming from a very narrow perspective on society and what constitutes good and progress and so on, then there's reason to think that that's problematic just from a sort of historical perspectives on. We already know that, you know, if there are so many communities in the world that if you ask them, of course, they don't think that AI is going to save them from environmental harm. Or I know of certain indigenous communities that, for example, are developing their own AI systems trained on data from their own cultures because they're finding the systems that are out there to not represent their best interests and so on. So yeah, I think the way, like where we're currently at, the hype may be too big in the sense of, like, from an environmental perspective and from a social justice perspective. It doesn't mean it's too late, but we need to think about these things.
Yeah, and speaking of that, you mentioned that, you know, it might not be too late, but I mean, one thing that strikes me is that many of the assumptions that we make, or sort of at least often explicitly, but I mean, at least implicitly, is that, you know, we're going to fix this problem in some sense. And sort of the assumption is often that this will be fixed. But in my view, and many other people's view, this is far from certain. And do you think there should be more discussions about AI, for example, in the event of the future not being that optimistic, assuming that we're on a path towards disruption and perhaps even collapse? How do you see AI discussions? Should AI be discussed in also a more pessimistic framing of things maybe not getting better?
Yeah, do you then mean like the sort of AI systems that we have now, or like future advanced AI?
I mean, more like from ethics perspectives, etc. So, I mean, if it will be the case that society is crumbling, so to say, and things just keep getting worse, then, I mean, I guess there's a lot of discussion to be had on how will AI play a role as that unfolds. I mean, everything from how will warfare be shaped by AI, and you already mentioned a lot of ways in which AI already is affecting, let's say, in social media, what types of news we're fed with and what information we get and so on. So I was just wondering if you have thoughts on if that is something that might also be discussed, basically, or should we only focus on the case that things will be fine in the end?
No, I think that's a very good point. I think there is some focus on that in terms of more advanced AI playing a role in like more kind of dystopian scenarios. But I've definitely not seen a lot of focus on more like the role of current AI towards more like dystopian scenarios. And as you say, like of course there's a span between like now and what that could look like, and what would the role of AI be in that. I think that's very important. For example, as you say, in warfare, in disinformation, in manipulation of human behavior, in politics. It's already manipulating politics. It's already being used in warfare, actually, and so on. So yes, that would definitely be important. Another thing that I've found to be missing is, like, there's a lot of assumptions, if you look at a lot of AI literature on like what AI can do and become, and whether that's optimistic or whether that's like fantastical or catastrophic, it's often not accounted for what's everything else that's going on in the world at the same time. For example, if we don't manage to sort of handle the environmental crisis in any kind of meaningful sense, then, you know, will certain forms of AI even happen? Like it's completely dependent on a lot of other sort of environmental factors. This is like, I'm almost not seen any kind of debate on that. Like it's a lot of assumptions about technology sort of always being there and continuing regardless of everything else that's going on in the world, which, you know, just doesn't make any sense. But yeah, so there are different aspects to that.
Thank you. We have a question from Andre.
Yes, hi. Thanks a lot for these very interesting thoughts. And well, I wasn't really aware about this concept of anthropocentrism, but I want to ask you something that is maybe in a different direction, which is anthropomorphism, and the idea that you know, AI is always treated as something like a conscious thing that has its own goals and is doing things, and even the notion of just the AI is doing something, I always get like you know, shudders when I hear that. And I've been doing AI research for decades. I still don't think that we're anywhere near something that has consciousness or we even should or could. So I'm interested in how you see that, also in the sense of how dangerous is the whole thing, because in the end it's just software that we make. It's
right.
It's not a living thing that was born. Or an alien that is coming to destroy us, or all these scenarios. That's
yeah. I think that's part of, like, not to like dash on that demographics to that extent, but like, of course, this idea about AI is also, you know, shaped by certain fantasies or ideals and so on. And the danger, of course, as you're saying, is that you're removing this like human responsibility and human agency aspects behind this technology, and giving a lot of power to this idea about AI, when it's, as you say, in fact, is all about human decisions, at least up until today. And another aspect about that is how AI is also, this is some of the work that's been done at the Leverhulme Center for Future Intelligence, how AI is also cast in this, in the image of, you know, the white male man. Like it's if it's portrayed as a human, it's portrayed as a specific form of human with specific interests and values and goals and so on, which is, you know, not representative of a lot of other groups of people or other interests. So yeah, I think it's also part of the hype about what some people want AI to be, but it's, as you said, like, it's very far from what we're having today. If that's intentional or not, like, it's hard to say. Yeah, that maybe answer your question.
I think it can also distract from real problems. To have this image of something that probably, I think, will never exist, and so it's a bit of the wrong discussion at some point.
Yeah, there's also
why
like,
we're afraid of something that well, maybe will exist in 1,000 years or even not then. But
yeah, there's a lot of sort of techno solutionism out there. Like, I've seen proposals for, you know, using AI to lift heavy industry off Earth to solve the climate crisis. Like, it's way too late by the time we have the capacities to do that. Like, it's fanciful idea.
Well, there are people busy with moving to Mars.
Yes, but that's also not going to solve the environmental crisis.
No.
But but it's, I mean, yeah, it's hard to say, because you have, I think the field of AI is so big. Like, you have the AI industry, you have a lot of this like tech hype, and then you have AI like AI as an existential risk, which is quite different demographic. And then you have like AI ethics, which is more broadly concerned with like algorithmic biases and so on. Like there's a lot of different kinds of people, so we shouldn't sort of generalize. But yeah, those ideas certainly exist and are definitely problematic and distracting from realistic solutions. Let's put it like that. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks a lot for your insights and inspiration.
Thank you.
Are there further questions? Björn has one more question.
I was just thinking about one thing during this last conversation about anthropomorphism. I remember 25 years ago or so when I tried to do my own PhD, which didn't succeed, by the way. I looked quite much into this particular topic, and I just think that we humans, we have a natural tendency to anthropomorphize and agentify, agentify almost anything. We always have. I remember an influential researcher at MIT called Nash and his team. They published a book called The Media Equation, how people treat computers, etc., media as real persons. And I think that is something that we always do. We tend to, we treat corporations as people in many senses. And our TVs and inanimate objects that we are well aware on one level are not sentient, but we still take what Dennett calls the intentional stance towards that's something that's quite deep in our cognitive structure. We have an intentional stance towards almost anything. So I think that's a big part of it as well. Just a thought.
Yeah, I agree. There's actually, if you're familiar with David Gunkel and Mark Kuckelberg and these guys are actually working on this topic in relation to AI, how do we relate to these machines, and what are the sort of moral relationships that go into these, like if we find ourselves in a society with sort of new forms of artificial entities, it's maybe not a problem that we conceptualize them in a certain way, but how we do it and how we relate to them and how we use them to promote certain interests or values and so on. So that's not my I'm not an expert on that, but if you're interested in them, look up the work of Mark Kuckelberg and David Gunkel. They're doing a lot of great work on that, like human robot relationships in a moral sense. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Time is just about up, and I think we should join in giving Andrea an applaud. We have the various technologies for doing that. I'll just do this. By stopping the recording, I hereby